Zia Yusuf, welcome. You've come fresh from a Reform Party press conference this morning. Last week you were Reform Party chairman. This morning you have been watching your colleague David Bull named as party chairman. How do you feel?
I feel good. I feel very good. It's great to be back. It's great to be back. And, you know, in those 48 hours or so that passed after I sent that tweet, which I now regret, I was inundated with messages, emails, DMs from people who told me how important reform was to them. You know, it's much more than a political party. It is a movement, they believe, which frankly, many of these people were putting in their messages. It represents, for many of them, the last hope the country has to turn itself around. And I'm paraphrasing what almost all the messages said. They were lovely, they were heartfelt, They also underscored how important they thought I was within the movement. And many of them were just very declaratively asking me to reconsider. And as is often the case, as I said at the press conference, and I think people watching this hopefully can empathise with this, sometimes it takes a little distance from someone or something for you to realise how important something is. And so those things coming together just made me realise, look, I'd made a mistake. I think this is the most important work of my life. I came into politics out of a sense of duty. You know, I worked in the city, I've worked in business, thankfully.
Made a lot of money.
Yeah, well, thankfully, I no longer need to work for money. And, you know, I love this country. It's a country that, as we were just saying before we started recording, has been so kind to my parents who came here in the early 1980s, presented me with such immense opportunity. And I felt like I couldn't let people down. I came into politics because when I saw Nigel said he was coming back, and people might remember, Nigel originally said he wasn't going to come back, if you remember, said he was going to go to the States.
Yes.
And then, you know, so many people said to him, Nigel, we need you. And thank goodness he changed his mind. I think that decision, which was incredibly courageous, and I think that decision will go down as one that changed the course of British history. So look, I'm here. My commitment is redoubled. I am firmly of the view Nigel needs to be the Prime Minister. We need a reformed government. I'm going to continue to give my all to make that happen.
Did you apologise to all of your colleagues after?
Yeah, I did, because my tweet was an intemperate tweet born of exhaustion, which I
Was it
I
the
regret.
wording you regret? Was it?
I regret.
Dumb?
No, look,
The burka.
Well, so we'll come to the burka bit in a minute, because it would be useful just to clarify that. But in terms of the tweet, it was the decision to resign, and I don't mind saying, you know, I'm a workaholic. I've given my all. You know, one of my favourite passages from Scripture is, "Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, doeth with thy might," and I've always subscribed to that. I give my all to everything that I do. We've had 11 months of building this party, and we've achieved, I think, something truly extraordinary. I think the May the 1st elections will go down as probably the most historically important set of local elections in this country's history. And I basically hadn't had a day off. Even after the election, you may remember I was at the Runcorn count.
Up all night.
Amazing. Lots of adrenaline. And I barely got any rest then, because then it was straight off to do media rounds, and then it was straight to the Kent celebration, and then straight off to go and launch 10 councils.
OK, so are you going to change your working patterns then? Because I think the logic of what you're saying is you were burnt out. You were working too hard, and that led you to lose your temper, ill-advised tweet, full of regret. So have we got or have Reform got a different Zia Yusuf back after apologising to you?
So, look, the one change I am going to make, because I think it was a confluence of multiple issues. One was also my information diet, especially in that job of doing all sorts. Frankly, I was doing about 8 to 10 jobs, just because not because I wanted to do them, but when I arrived as chairman, there was basically no infrastructure, virtually no team. There wasn't a political party. And so we've assembled this thing that is growing, with 400 odd branches. We've got well over 250,000 members now. So one thing I'm going to do is spend less time on X, because the information, you know, one of the things the messages really underscored to me. I mean, candidly, I got a lot of it when we were knocking on the doors in Runcorn. But otherwise, you know, the day-to-day job that I was doing, running from one thing to the other, you just don't hear from those people. And those are the people to whom we owe everything, the whole movement is dedicated to, and for whom everything Nigel and the MPs and everyone at Reform is doing is so important. So that is an important change I'm going to make. I think in terms of work, I maybe that's something that people might recommend. I love what I do. I do it with energy. I will take a holiday, even a few days off. I think would be helpful. But this is a time-limited mission, and I don't mind saying that. I've said that all along. It is my view that if we don't get a reform government at the next general election with Nigel as the Prime Minister, I don't know if there will be a country worth saving. And I say that advisedly, having thought about it deeply.
So less time on X.
Yes.
That's going to be a change.
Yes.
I think in many ways it perverts politics because we take that to think that that's what's Britain speaking, and it's not.
Yeah. Well, exactly. I think there's a lot of non-UK use people commenting, and I think there's a lot of bots as well.
Nigel Farage said last week that you snapped after receiving a tirade of personal racist abuse on social media. What sort of abuse do you have to take? Nobody should have to be subject to any of it. But what sort of abuse are we talking about here? Well,
look, I want to be really clear. I take personal and full responsibility for the error of judgment that I made. Politics is a rough and tumble. But find me a politician, anyone in frontline politics who doesn't get abuse, racist or otherwise, misogyny for women. Yeah. It's horrible. It's awful. Unfortunately, I think moderation on social media is a difficult problem. So I take full ownership and responsibility of it. In terms of the racial stuff, number one, they're not reform supporters, certainly in the main. They're not reform supporters. That's the first point.
How do you know?
Secondly, well, just because you can see from other stuff that they're saying, right? And secondly, I think what's really important is that if you come into politics, it is really important you believe in something, and you're doing it because you have some values and principles that you would like to be much more prevalent inside the country. And that really does describe everyone inside reform. So, look, the reality is a lot of that stuff, it was really a function, as I said, of the exhaustion, multiplied by too much time on X.
So, when it comes to the burqa, Sarah Pochin called for a ban. Lee Anderson, the Reform MP, backed her. Richard Tice was slightly different. He said a debate was needed. What's your position on that? Which of those positions do you take?
Yeah, so to be specific on the burqa, I've thought about it a lot, and not just in the last few days. I think on balance, I think about it very deeply, but I probably would, if I was an MP, which obviously I'm not, but if I was, I probably would vote to ban facial coverings in public, which the burqa would be included within that. I've personally seen Antifa thugs confront reform supporters, threaten Nigel, knock a tooth out for one of Nigel's security team. I have some trepidation around it, only because I do firmly believe in liberal values like freedom of religion, which is a very important value that Britain gave the world. Secondly, because Britain's constitution is unwritten and frankly has been trampled by successive left-wing governments, I include the Tories in that, I always like to reference against the constitution in America, which is obviously written, and such a ban would be unconstitutional. So I'd always be very cautious about passing legislation here that would be unconstitutional there. But I do think we are in a very specific time in the UK. And so on balance, I probably would be in favour of a ban. Yeah.
You think it should be in your manifesto then?
Nigel's been clear it's not a big priority. We don't have a manifesto for the next general election yet. And so, look, it is a really difficult one. There's a reason why Richard's view was slightly nuanced and different to Lee. I think that's perfectly reasonable. I think, what the other thing I'd say is, if you're passing legislation, it's all very easy to have a knee-jerk reaction to say, that's not something we want. But I think it is very important that one thinks very carefully about implications of legislation, because if, for example, you were to do such a ban, perhaps it opens the door for other expressions of religious or religiosity to potentially be curtailed. I hope Reform win the next election. We're working to do that. I hope we're the natural form of government. But who knows? One day, heaven forbid, we might get the opposite sort of a government to a Reform government. And would they take a view on the Star of David or people wearing the crucifix? And these were questions, by the way, that were raised in France at the time when that was discussed. So it's a very nuanced issue, and there's not much room, obviously, for nuance on Twitter and day-to-day politics. But on balance, I think I would be in favour of the ban. Yeah.
Do you worry that some women will be fearful when they hear that? Some women who wear the burqa? Is there a danger of that?
I don't think so, no. I certainly hope not. In the end, we are, look, the most important thing is that we try to formulate policies that do the most good for the most people. I think that's what the most important thing is. I will say too, I mean, maybe we'll talk more about this later, but the country does have really big problems with assimilation right now. I don't think that's a controversial statement. In many ways, the burqa is emblematic of that. And in some ways, the whole discussion about the burqa is downstream from a conversation about British culture, British values. And I think that has actually been the case. If you look at the discourse around the ban in places like France and other European countries, that has been the case. So I would also say that the risk in around all of this discussion is that we become really myopic about one specific thing instead of having a much bigger and more important conversation, I think, about immigration, the numbers of people coming here, the countries from which they come, the composition of people who come here from within those countries, and assimilation. I think those are really, really important conversations.
Okay, let's talk about assimilation. So what might be a measure of whether we regard success in assimilating?
Yeah.
We could talk about, you have to speak English. We could talk about arranged marriage. Mm-hmm. We could talk about first cousin marriage. Mm-hmm. Are any of those measures, you may have others, are any of those things, signs that are integral to assimilation?
Totally. And some of those are measurable, right? So
they're all legal.
Let's talk about English. Let's talk about speaking English. You can measure that by the amount of money that the taxpayer pays for translators. Like, totally measurable. That number is a huge number now and has been growing. And I don't think that's fair. Look, is there some nuance around that? Yes, maybe for a totally genuine, legitimate asylum seeker who applied through proper channels and has come here legal, all of that stuff, fine, right? But the enormous amounts of money now that is being spent on translators inside our health service, inside the Home Office, totally unacceptable. And that is measurable, right? And so I would be totally in favour of saying the British taxpayer should not be funding taxpayers, certainly so it should not be funding English translators for the most part. Then if you look at...
So speaking English is a non-negotiable for you?
Of course. I don't think somebody should be... we can have a separate conversation about how we need to basically cut net migration to zero, I think, for a number of years. Yeah. But to the degree people are granted citizenship, I think the idea that should be done without people having a really firm and strong grasp of English is completely unacceptable, partly because being a citizen of this country is an absolute privilege. And so in many ways, a failure to learn English is a demonstration that you're not taking it particularly seriously. And so, look, you're always going to get some nuance and some exceptions. And, we're obviously talking about general policy here. But I think that's number one. I think cousin marriage, I think that's a really easy one. I'd be absolutely in favour of making that illegal. I think arranged marriage is a much more difficult one because how do you, again, if you're passing legislation and you're taking the business of government and legislating seriously, which reform does, how do you draft that legislation and how does that get proven? A lot of people are introduced by parents or whatever it is. So what I will say is, speaking English, absolutely non-negotiable. I don't think I'm actually amazed these things are even really up for debate. I don't know what the compelling counter-argument is to these things. And what I will also say, as I said on the Today programme yesterday, is that resentment is building. I think the social contract in this country is not just fraying. I think it's hanging by a thread in every way, whether it's law and order, shoplifting basically being legal now under £200 de facto, whether it's certain communities being policed in a completely different way, sometimes by the police's own admission.
Let's just take shoplifting. Why do you think there's clearly an epidemic of shoplifting?
Yeah.
What's the public policy answer to that?
So I think you need a wholesale change in the way policing is done. I think it needs to be a police force, not a police service. And I think that police need to have clear KPIs, which involve... So look, it's a multivariant problem. The first one is making sure the police are KPI'd and understand that when they're spending less time filling out, what ethnicity you are, and then, all of the the questions that get asked in that place, or policing social
media.
Any of
that. You wouldn't do any of the recording because stop and search has long been an issue.
Yeah, I'd probably look. I'd certainly cut it back materially. But the most important thing is the police, it needs to be very clear that the police are there to identify and catch criminals. And to the degree they do not do that, they would be held accountable. Let me give you a data point on this, just to give you a sense of how upside down everything is. If you have a smartphone, I mean, how many people, if they're walking around now and they use their phone outside, you kind of hold it with two hands.
Yeah.
And you're sort of looking over your shoulder all the time. The reason for that is very good, which is that, there's a good reason why people do it. And the reason is that if your smartphone is stolen, the chances the suspect is even, or the actual criminal is even identified, let alone arrested, charged, imprisoned, is less than 1%. So put another way, if you go and steal somebody's phone today, you have a north of 99% chance of getting away with it. But then we also need to address our prisons. So if you take the Tory government, they spent 14 years expanding the size of the population by 6.5 million people through immigration.
Right.
And then do you know how many prison places they built? 411.
Yeah.
So we have a structural issue right now. We need to be massively ramping up incarceration capacity. If we do that, we have police who actually understand their job is not just to police. So, if you put out an intemperate tweet in many cases, you have a much higher chance of having the police knock on your door than if you actually commit crime, in some cases violent crime. So we've got to have the police doing their jobs, and we need more prison space.
An intemperate tweet. Forgive me, well, I hope I remember this woman's name correctly.
Yeah.
Lucy Connelly.
Yeah.
Was that an intemperate tweet?
I think, one of the interesting things about, for example, incitement to violence in the United States versus here is, in the United States, at least my understanding, is that the prosecutor has to draw a direct correlation, a direct link between an action somebody took in terms of violence and the speech, right? That isn't the case here. I think the tweet was appalling. It was absolutely diabolical and disgusting, the tweet. But look at the length of the prison sentence. I mean, there was a young man who went to jail, was convicted and went to jail for accessory to murder with a machete, who served a fraction of the amount of time that she is going to have to serve for that. And so one of the big problems here is, when I talk about the social contract, is that people in this country don't look at that tweet and don't look at this case and go, she should just, there's nothing wrong with that. The issue is what looks to a lot of people, and I think now there is data to suggest this, that there is a two-tier element to the way policing is done and to the way justice is being served for basically very similar things.
So I think what you're saying there is maybe she should have got a custodial sentence, but you're not convinced about the length of that sentence.
Yeah, look, I think what's certain is, do I think there was a crime there? Which is my personal opinion. Probably, just because of, it was called the nature of it. Yes, that's my view. But whether it should have been a jail term or not, and, it's a mother with children. I think all of, those things are so often taken into account with other cases. And like I said, how can you justify that, taking up, by the way, a valuable prison place right now, when a young man, just to give one example, who was an accessory to murder of, I think, a 16-year-old with a machete, served a fraction of the duration of her sentence and is now out free. That is appalling and needs to change.
Now, we are not in the same parties, but we have something in common. Both our parents came to this country to work. Your parents migrated from Sri Lanka to the UK in the 80s. Your dad is still an NHS doctor. Mm-hmm. Your mum's still an NHS nurse. Mm-hmm. My parents came to this country from Italy to work in the textile mills in Bradford. Under a reform government, would our parents be able to make that journey here, to work here, to feel welcome here?
So look, I think I understand why you asked the question, but sort of the notion that because I think Rishi Sunak was asked a similar question. And I remember hearing that. I wasn't in politics then. Mm-hmm. And it just struck me, the idea that the implication of such a question is that Rishi Sunak should have been formulating immigration policy, calibrating around whether it would allow his parents. So in my view, that has got nothing to do with policy formation. But I will say this. If you look at when, for example, my parents came to the country, in the early 1980s, net migration was anywhere between 25 and 50,000 a year. For the last few years, it's been run rating anywhere between 600,000 and 1 million, right? And so the numbers are absolutely staggering. So numbers matter, composition matters. The reason why the numbers matter, by the way, we were talking about assimilation earlier, is because if a relatively small number of people are coming and they're high skilled, my father had just had qualified as a medical doctor. He came straight here. They had to go wherever the work was. I was born in Bells Hill in Scotland. My little sister was born in Truro in Cornwall. My brother went to, I think, 6 different primary schools because they had to go wherever the work was. It was kind of a really traditional immigrant story. So I think no one is more acutely aware of the invaluable contribution immigrants have made and can make to this country. But that doesn't mean, quote, diversity is our strength. Not true. And secondly, the numbers that have been coming over the last decade are staggering. So we have to cut that to zero now on a net basis for a number of years.
60s in my parents' case, 80s in your parents' case, we'd have to have a look at, if they wanted to come here today, we'd have to examine them on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, well, look, so we're saying we want to cut immigration to 1 in, 1 out, right? And you do get several 100,000 people who leave naturally. Sadly, it seems to be accelerating, particularly, this is the other really dangerous thing, just looking at the numbers even, because what's happening is, if you look at the people coming and the people leaving, some of our brightest and best and the big income tax, it's not necessarily hugely politically popular to say this, but every time a millionaire leaves this country, they are taking with them significant tax revenues that pay for nurses, doctors, prisons and police officers and all sorts of things. So we've got to focus not just on the numbers, but we've got to to the degree we have people come. So, maybe the answer is yes, because we will still have a few, we will have visas given out only so that the net number is zero. They need to be very high skilled. They need to become people coming here, investing in businesses. I mean, look at Trump. Trump created this golden ticket program, right? And so if we should be absolutely focused on the fact that people are falling over themselves to come to this country. We're still fortunate enough for that to happen. We should only be taking the very best.
Will you be a Reform parliamentary candidate at the next election? I assume that you will be standing for Parliament at the next election.
I haven't given it much thought. I want to serve in whatever capacity that I can to help the country and help the party. I think there's a decent chance of that, but I genuinely haven't given it much thought.
Doesn't everybody who's in politics dream of becoming Prime Minister one day?
Interestingly not. You'd have thought that, but probably a lot. But look, I'd not met many frontline politicians before I came into politics. And, there are some who just are very happy being backbench MPs. I think, I want to do whatever I can, as I said, to serve the country, and reform is the best way to do that. I mean, look, most of the work, as Nigel said at the press conference this morning, I did as chairman, were things that, because we've literally started from scratch. I mean, I was having to approve second approved payments at the bank and fill out HMRC. It was all stuff that was critical stuff they've done because the infrastructure wasn't there. We've now done that sort of phase one, that startup phase. Now we're at scale up phase. So it does mean, as I said, the role of leading the Doge project to identify waste and root it out, and probably corruption too, frankly.
Give Rachel Reeves a bit of advice for tomorrow. Is the spending review?
Yeah. Take everything that you have done and probably will do as Chancellor and do the opposite, would be my advice. I think you've got someone, sadly, this is actually the problem, just to move away, not make it too personal about Rachel Reeves, is almost none of the Labour cabinet have ever achieved or done anything hard.
Anything you're going to cut, because you're now in charge of reforms, you're a reforms voice for government efficiency.
Yeah.
Do you think Rachel Reeves, Chancellor of the Exchequer, if you just cut that, you'd put Britain on a better path?
So look, number one, the whole net zero nonsense, right? So £12 billion that is directly found inside departmental budgets, gone. That's immediate. And by the way, here's the irony. When we talk about cuts in government spending, most of the cuts we're talking about would improve people's lives. So if you got rid of that £12 billion of net zero spending, what you're also doing is reducing energy prices in this country, which are probably the biggest input factor to economic growth. That's why there's no growth. They're in this doom loop right now. And starting, I think, to backpedal. So that's number one. You'd scrap the net zero. Number two, the asylum hotels. If you deport everybody who's here in the country illegally, we think it's going to cost high end of the estimates, maybe 11 odd billion. It's a lot of money, but it's a one-off cost. But currently, the cost just for the asylum and illegal migrant accommodation is touching 6 billion and growing. So you're already talking about 15 billion inside Nigel's first term as Prime Minister. So that's where I'd start.
Okay. Final question. I was reading an old interview you did in 2018. You said this: I come from a traditional Asian background, and when I go home, my mum asks me when I'm getting married. I just wondered if your mum, 7 years on, is she any closer to getting an answer to that question?
I hope she's not watching this, because you know what's funny is when I called her just to let her know I was going to be returning to Reform before she sort of read about it in the press, and she picked up the phone. Before I said anything, she said, and I think she was sad that I had left, but she said, Zia, you know, at least this means now you have more time to get married. So it's funny you asked the question.
Zia Yusuf, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure.